Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Imagine overthrowing a centuries-old, incredibly oppressive monarchy to build a brand new utopia, one based entirely on human rights, only for that exact same fight for freedom to spiral into an absolute bloody dictatorship. Today, we're unpacking the ultimate historical paradox, the French Revolution, and how a genuine quest for liberty somehow plummeted into absolute terror. Seriously, picture this. You and your neighbors rise up, you draft this beautiful Declaration of the Rights of Man, and you proudly declare that all people are born free and equal. Sounds amazing, right? Yet, fast forward just a little bit, and the gutters of Paris are literally running red with blood. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity somehow pave the way for mass executions and extreme state coercion. How in the world does that happen? Well, to give you an idea of the sheer scale of this tragedy, 50,000. Just let that sink in for a second. That is the shocking estimated number of people killed during a period known as the Reign of Terror. It was this era of intense, state-sanctioned paranoia where the newly formed revolutionary government basically went to war against its own people. Section 1. The Rigged Game of France. To really understand how things went so violently off the rails, we have to hit the rewind button back to 1789 to see the deeply rigged system that started the whole thing. Because you really can't grasp the anger of the revolution without understanding the absolute inequity of the old regime. France was divided into three distinct social classes, or estates. You've got the first estate, which was the clergy, and the second, the nobility. Together, they made up just 2% of the population. But here's the kicker. They held practically all the wealth, all the top government jobs, and were exempt from most taxes. Meanwhile, the third estate, which was literally everyone else, making up 98% of the country, carried the entire crushing tax burden. And the brutal math of this starvation is just mind-blowing. By 1789, massive royal debt and terrible harvests had completely crippled the economy. Imagine spending almost your entire daily paycheck just to buy a single loaf of bread to feed your family. A laborer making 20 sous a day was shelling out 15 sous just for bread. It was the yeast of their problems, quite literally. But jokes aside, when people are spending that much of their livelihood just to survive, pure desperation sets in. Section 2, the people take control. Hungry, exhausted, and completely locked out of the political process, the common people finally snapped. This desperation triggered an explosive chain of events. Just look at this rapid-fire escalation. In May 1789, the king calls a meeting of the Estates General to fix the bankruptcy. But the Third Estate is treated like second-class citizens. So by June, they declare themselves the true National Assembly, famously swearing an oath on an indoor tennis court not to leave until they have a constitution. And then the ultimate spark. On July 14th, fearing the king's armies, the people violently topple the Bastille fortress in Paris just to steal gunpowder. In 3 months, they entirely seized the narrative. And this urban uprising, it spread like wildfire to the countryside, sparking massive peasant rebellions. To calm the chaos down, the National Assembly held a late-night session in August 1789. In a single night of idealistic frenzy, the elites surrendered their centuries-old privileges. They completely abolished the feudal system. They ended tax exemptions and declared that merit, not birth, would decide who gets government jobs. They practically erased the old regime overnight. Section 3, Liberty, Equality, and Paranoia. So the revolutionaries had their victory. They even marched on the Palace of Versailles and forced the king to move to Paris, making him effectively a hostage to the people's will. But almost immediately, an atmosphere of intense suspicion began to poison their new society. Here's the crucial point. While the new laws sounded beautiful on paper, they were full of immediate hypocrisies. The Declaration of the Rights of Man stated all men were born equal, but in reality, the Assembly restricted voting rights to active citizens, meaning men who owned a certain amount of property. It excluded the very poor, it totally excluded women, and it completely ignored the enslaved people in France's colonies. It was liberty, sure, but only for a select few. And this hypocrisy quickly snowballed into total chaos. In 1791, the king actually attempts to flee France in disguise, totally shattering whatever public trust was left. Then, foreign monarchs in Austria and Prussia threaten to literally destroy Paris if the king is harmed. This creates massive paranoia. The people feel they have enemies everywhere, inside and outside their borders. This fear triggers a violent insurrection in August 1792 that suspends the monarchy entirely. Section 4. The Reign of Terror. With foreign armies literally at the gates and civil war brewing inside the country, the newly formed French Republic makes a fateful decision. They decide to suspend the very liberties they had just fought for, all in the name of saving the Republic. The radical leader Maximilien Robespierre perfectly captures the terrifying psychology of this era. He genuinely believed that to protect the virtuous ideals of the revolution from its enemies, state-sanctioned terror was a moral necessity. In his mind, if you weren't fully with the revolution, you were a traitor to humanity itself. This drastically changed the justice system, effectively erasing the rights they had just won in 1789. Back then, they promised the presumption of innocence. But by 1793, they passed the law of suspects. You could be arrested for vague hostile remarks, or honestly, just lacking enthusiasm. Revolutionary tribunals had no juries, and get this, there were only 2 verdicts allowed: acquittal or death. It created a horrific system where terrified neighbors denounced neighbors, and the blade of the guillotine rarely stopped dropping. 750,000. At the exact same time, to fight off the invading armies of Europe, the revolutionary government instituted the levée en masse. They drafted an unprecedented 750,000 young unmarried men into the military. This was essentially the very first modern total war, where the entire nation's resources were mobilized just for combat. But drafting hundreds of thousands of people doesn't exactly happen quietly. This massive draft sparked a rural, Catholic, and royalist rebellion in the Vendée region of western France, and it escalated into a brutal, scorched-earth civil war. Up to 200,000 people perished as revolutionary armies were sent in to mercilessly crush the uprising. It showed just how deeply divided the French people really were. It wasn't just the people against the king anymore, it was the people against each other. Section 5. Exhaustion and the Directory. Eventually, the revolution began to eat its own children. The endless cycle of purity tests, paranoia, and bloodshed absolutely exhausted the nation. No one felt safe, not even the radical leaders. Fearing they would be the next victims, politicians in the assembly finally turned on Robespierre. In July 1794, he met the very guillotine he had used on so many others. The terror cooled down, and by 1795, a new government called the Directory took power. But honestly, it was a weak, conservative regime. It was plagued by corruption and only managed to survive by continuously rigging elections and relying on the military to crush protests. And what about the common people through all this? Well, runaway inflation had destroyed the economy all over again. The paper money was practically worthless. This quote from a starving Parisian woman in 1796 really highlights the deep cynicism of the time. The people had fought a revolution to escape starvation and oppression, only to find themselves starving under a new group of corrupt politicians who seems to only care about enriching themselves. Section 6. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. Desperate for normal life, craving basic competence, and wanting national glory, the French people began to look away from the squabbling politicians. They looked to the only institution in France that was actually succeeding, the army. And that pure exhaustion paved the way for the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799. A young, wildly popular, and brilliantly successful general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power. And what's amazing is that he met with almost zero public resistance. The people were just done. This nearly bloodless military takeover marked the definitive death of the decade-long chaotic Republican experiment. Napoleon essentially offered France an authoritarian bargain. He promised to crush the political chaos and end the factional violence. Crucially, he maintained the core social equalities won by the revolution, like the abolition of feudalism and the protection of property rights. But in exchange, the people had to give up their democratic political rights. They traded their hard-won voices for order and stability under an autocratic ruler. As we wrap up this explainer, the French Revolution leaves us with a really profound and slightly unsettling question. It shows us how quickly idealism can transform into terror when it's driven by fear and absolute moral certainty. It forces us to ask ourselves, how much of our own freedom, our own democratic rights, would we willingly trade for security if we were pushed to the absolute edge? It's a historical lesson that remains incredibly relevant today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.